Napoleon's Grande Armée stormed across Europe between 1805 and 1807, brushing aside the once great armies of the old regimes and forcing them to adapt and adopt the French tactical systems. The credit for this success is usually given to the Emperor, and it was no doubt his genius at a grand tactical level that helped to set up these victories, but without the small-scale tactical advantages that the French held over their adversaries, battles such as Auerstadt would not have been possible. However, the seeds for this tactical superiority were not to be found in the Napoleonic era, nor in the Revolutionary Wars, but instead were a product of the debates held under the Ancien regime during the 18th century. They were finally codified in the regulations of 1791, which were to remain the basis of French tactics throughout the period and were not majorly altered until 40 years later. In this short series, I'm going to trace the origins of these tactics, first by looking separately at each of the three arms, before examining their combinations at a grand tactical level. I will hopefully show that the French revolutionary armies were not the mindless rabbles that they are often perceived to be, before highlighting some of the main techniques and tactics that set La Grande Armée apart from its peers during its 2-year tour of Europe. Infantry is undoubtedly the most important arm of the service, since it forms 4/5 of an army and is used both in the attack and defence of positions. Experience long ago taught me that one of the most difficult tactical problems is that of determining the best formation of troops for battle, but I have also learned that to solve this problem by the use of a single method is an impossibility. Although much is spoken of the three arms being used in combination during this period, it was, as it remains to this day, the infantry that were key to battlefield success, and it is in this area where the French were arguably the most ahead of their rivals. Unfortunately, the common narrative tends to revolve around the notion of line versus column, implying that the French troops, particularly during the Revolutionary Wars, were capable only of using columns in order to smash through the enemy lines in blunt force attacks. This simplistic view not only downplays the French achievements, but it also discredits their adversaries, who often fought well and were simply tactically outfought rather than beaten by such brute force tactics. There was a nuance to French tactics, which was then studied and either adapted or adopted by almost all who came against it, and this is shamefully disregarded by too many who study the period. Therefore, in the following video, I am going to examine these tactics and show just what it was that allowed the French to take infantry warfare into a new direction, but first we must look into the origins and creation of these tactics. When the firearm was first introduced on a wide scale onto the battlefield in the 16th century, it was not immediately the dominant weapon that it was to eventually become. The reason for this was that, initially being matchlock, it was slow to fire and unreliable, plus it had no use beyond becoming a simple club for shock action, which was a key purpose of infantry. Worse, the musketeer, as the soldier wielding the weapon was to be called, was very vulnerable to enemy shock action, particularly when he was reloading his weapon, and especially when facing enemy cavalry. Therefore, to negate these risks, musketeers were grouped in units with pikemen, who usually formed as a solid central phalanx upon which the musketeers could fall back when threatened. The pike was retained, but in a typical battalion of the later 16th and 17th centuries, it was combined with firearms. The centre of the battalion, when drawn up in combat array, was composed of pikemen and was long called the battle. On each flank were the fire troops. These arquebusiers, and later the musketeers, were helpless against cavalry. Sent out as skirmishers to harass the enemy, they had to retire when attacked by mounted troops. The pikemen were therefore necessary to give solidity and resistance to the battle line. At first the pikemen predominated, and the arquebusiers were used chiefly as skirmishers. With the development of the musket, a heavier but more efficient weapon, fire became more effective, and fire troops became more important in action. As Quimby points out, during this period, the pikemen were seen as the primary soldiers, and the musketeers were seen as supporting elements, and fought and fired their weapons as individuals, not in the mass volleys that were to become standard in due course. However, as the firearm became more efficient, eventually becoming the flintlock musket, the roles of the infantry gradually switched, and with the invention of the bayonet, initially plug but eventually socket, the pike's role became practically redundant. The ascendancy of the firearm continued until, at the beginning of the 18th century, the combination of a sufficiently reliable musket with a fixed or fixable bayonet, bayonets having been introduced into the British service in 1672, finally eliminated the pike as a separate weapon. This change came about through practical experience, as the power and effectiveness of the firearm began to prove itself, and the gradual process of its dominance can be seen in the French numbers. In the French army, the pikemen were first reduced to 1/2 total, then to 1/3 in 1651, to 1/4 in 1677, and to 1/5 in 1688. They were entirely suppressed in 1703. With the musket's place as the primary infantry weapon secured, the debate now turned to tactics, particularly how best to utilize the weapon. Two great developments followed the adoption of the socket bayonet and the suppression of the pike. The first was a single uniform type of line infantry, which greatly simplified the order of battle. This had not been possible since portable firearms had first made their influence on the battlefield. The second was the combination of a fire weapon and a shock weapon in one arm. As a result, infantry that was equipped to fight primarily with the firepower could now fight in either manner and could resist successfully the attacks of cavalry. As observed here, for probably the first time in warfare, the infantry soldier's equipment was not only universal, but it also enabled him to act in both shock and fire action. This, however, created a new debate: to which method of action was he best suited? The obvious answer, it would seem, is that firepower would make the best use of a gun. However, due to the limited range, slow rate of fire, and at times ineffectiveness of the weapon, there were still many who believed that shock action was the only way of deciding infantry on infantry engagements. In fact, the English, during their Civil War, ran into this dilemma during the very first battle. At Edge Hill in 1642, it was found that the level of fire generated, although sustainable, was insufficient to force a conclusion in a firefight between infantry regiments. The result for the British was the spawning of a tactical doctrine that utilised both fire and shock action to decide engagements, a topic which I discussed in more depth in a previous video. However, on the continent, the debate appeared more binary, and very much one of fire or shock action, with discussions centering around formations, namely column versus line. The column was the preferred formation of those favouring shock action, as it allowed for a much quicker traversing of the battlefield, and, to some people's minds, the depth of the column not only spurred the courage and tenacity of the men inside of it, but its size would frighten the enemy, greatly increasing the chances for success of the shock action. Of course, the disadvantage to the column is that not only does its size and depth present a tempting target for enemy artillery, but its shorter frontage limits the number of muskets which can effectively fire, thus stunting the potential firepower of the unit. This is why those who advocated for fire action favoured a 3-rank linear formation, allowing, in theory, the entire unit to lay down its maximum firepower. However, line also has inherent weaknesses, namely its vulnerability, particularly to cavalry, on its flanks, as well as its limited mobility on the battlefield, due to the necessity to maintain alignment within both the unit and the battle line. Unsurprisingly, using the musket as a firearm, and not just a glorified spear, quickly became the preferred utilisation, and therefore line became the standard formation. Its vulnerability to flank attack was seemingly alleviated on a grand tactical scale by simply deploying each unit next to one another in a continuous line, and then anchoring the remaining exposed flanks on a piece of impassable terrain, such as a village, a woods, or a river. Armies deployed in flat terrain, and the commanders tried to rest their flanks on impassable obstacles. This style would become known as linear warfare, and although figures such as Marlborough were able to excel under its conditions, the line versus column debate never subsided, and throughout the first half of the 18th century there were still many opponents to both fire action and linear formations. Two such prominent figures were the French military writers, Chevalier de Foulard and Marshal Maurice de Saxey. Although Saxey was a well-respected French commander and innovative thinker in military matters, in fact foreseeing certain elements of Napoleonic warfare, both he and Foulard shared a dislike and mistrust of fire action. The subject of fire was one of the few matters wherein Saxey was not forward-looking. He had little use for fire, which, he declared, caused more noise than damage. Those who relied upon it were always beaten. Foulard's belief was different in that he believed prolonged firefights caused an excessive number of casualties, often without result. However, like Saxey, he believed that shock action was the only way to decide the infantry actions decisively, and thus, in his mind, prevent excessive casualties. The solution of both men was to deliver this shock action in the form of columns, favouring depth and velocity in order to break through the enemy. This preference for shock over fire was further emphasised, with Foulard advocating for the return of the pike for the front ranks, while Saxey called for the return of the plug bayonet in order to prevent the men from stopping and firing during an advance. Despite the writing of both these men gaining some traction in military circles, during the middle of the 18th century it seemed that the line versus column and fire versus shock debates had been firmly put to bed by a man synonymous with linear warfare, Frederick the Great. In his early campaigns, he ordered his infantry to advance with cold steel only, but experience soon revealed that this was impossible even for his best regiments. Massive volleys became the decisive element of his infantry combat, and in his military testament of 1768 he concluded that infantry firing more rapidly will undoubtedly defeat infantry firing more slowly. Frederick had inherited a well-disciplined and drilled regular infantry from his father, but he further perfected them through constant work on the parade ground. The introduction of a cadenced step enabled his men to march quicker on the battlefield whilst maintaining their line formation, and the result of a strict drill and repeated practice meant that they were able to fire and reload their weapons much quicker than their opponents, reputably reaching a volume of fire as high as 5 rounds a minute. Whilst this was perhaps unlikely under battlefield conditions, a more conservative 3 rounds a minute was still faster than their counterparts and enabled them to establish dominance in the firefights. The Prussians intensely rehearsed loading and firing until a Prussian infantry battalion could get off 5 rounds per minute, which in most other armies was an achievement only of elite units or of occasional individual soldiers. To maintain a high rate of fire, the Prussians adopted an iron ramrod. The traditional wooden ones frequently broke during reloading. It wasn't just fire supremacy that enabled the Prussians to see such success, but also their ability to march and deploy much quicker than their opponents, enabling Frederick to bring an element of manoeuvre back to the battlefield. The rapid fire of Frederick's walking batteries inflicted casualties and shook the morale of his opponents, but his most important contribution was to restore manoeuvring to the battlefield. By dividing his battalions into platoons, he was able to maneuver in columns of platoons across the enemy front. The short range of small arms made this a practical move, and he then could wheel them into line against the enemy's weakest flank. This method, in which one wing of his army was reinforced while the other was refused, became his famous oblique order of attack. Of course, it was not new, but only the Prussian army had the precision to execute it successfully. Frederick led his armies to many successes in both the Austrian War of Succession and then the 7 Years' Wars, and although the other 2 arms, particularly his cavalry, were important components of his success, it was his infantry that were to take many of the plaudits, and soon enough most of Europe were rewriting their infantry regulations so as to emulate the Prussian methods. Spain and Russia introduced Prussian drill, and Austria followed with Daun's regulations in 1769, close copies of the Prussian model. Despite being on the losing side during the 7 Years' War, and experiencing first-hand the impressive firepower of Frederick's infantry, the French army's school of thought was still divided as to which form of infantry doctrine was preferred. Some were followers of Frederick and called for the exclusive use of linear formations, whereas others still believed in the bayonet and the power of shock action delivered via attack columns as being the only decisive tactic. One of the main causes of this renewed debate was the writings of the Baron de Mesnil-Durand. Although his work, the Projet d'un ordre François en tactique, was published in 1755, the year prior to the beginning of the 7 Years' War, its impact was to once more flare up the tactical debate, for he, like Saxe and Forlord before him, was an advocate of shock and column. Mesnil-Durand favoured shock combat, declaring, like Saxe, that fire was not very formidable and that it would be fatal to depend upon it. It was best to rely upon cold steel and to come to grips with the enemy. Despite his experiences of fighting alongside the Prussians in the War of Austrian Succession, Mesnil-Durand was adamant that not only were firearms ineffective, but also artillery, declaring that cannon count for almost nothing in battles. He believed so strongly in both his tactical system and the superiority of dense columns, which he said offered both speed and depth, that he felt nothing could possibly oppose them. As to be expected, he faced a fair share of contemporary critics, particularly once the 7 Years' War proved the superiority of Prussian drill, but perhaps the best overview is provided by the historian Quimby, who notes the absurd assumptions and dismissal of morale in all of Mesnil-Durand's tactical theories. In all of this, human psychology was ignored. He assumed that troops would advance through enemy fire and not reply, that they would not shrink from a danger which they could not answer, that is, that they would neither halt and attempt to fire nor recoil. He assumed that heavy losses would merely stimulate his troops to press on to contact in order to end them. He assumed that this mass, advancing rapidly, would preserve its ranks in perfect order and not crowd up, causing interior confusion. In concluding, one can say that Mesnil-Durand exhibited the exclusiveness of many of the military writers of this period in its most extreme form. More than any other writer, he held the naive idea that a tactical system could guarantee victory. Although it may seem odd as to why anyone would even consider these ideas, especially after Frederick's success, it must be remembered that much of this success was down to Frederick himself, his own genius in strategy alongside great battlefield handling, nor were the battles and campaigns as one-sided as they may appear. In fact, these new Prussian methods were not particularly new or revolutionary, more a perfection of the techniques of the period, as Wiley explains. In short, the infantry training and tactics of Frederick the Great did not alter the fundamentals of infantry warfare in his time. They achieved only a temporary advantage for his army, which was lost once rival armies approximated his methods of drill. In contrast, as we will see, the French tactics that came about towards the end of the century were to have a much greater impact, and it must be stated that glimpses of this system do in fact begin to shine through during this period, and it is naive to assume that the French army during the 7 Years' Wars were useless and void of any tactical depth. Quite the opposite, and many of the ideas proposed during the great tactical debates of the past half-century were trialled and tested during the war, often with mixed results. General knowledge about the French part in the 7 Years' War has been largely confined to the fact that French troops were generally badly led and often beaten. There is one idea which needs to be dispelled, and that is that, while the troops were poorly commanded, they were mediocre in all respects, especially tactics. On the contrary, this period is one of the most interesting, tactically speaking. During the war, all the ideas of the past 30 years, thin lines, mass formations, skirmishes, formations of readiness, battalion guns, and the divisional system were tried out, with a mistrust of routine and a desire for progress which was to lead to the complete recasting of our regulations and our tactics. Certainly, our infantry had gained very much in flexibility, and in the hands of more capable leaders it was able to obtain some decisive successes in spite of the greater precision of its adversaries. However, having ultimately been defeated, the French did look to their opponents for the reasons why, and soon enough Prussian influence was to find its way into French tactical theory, unfortunately removing much of this newfound flexibility. One of the main figures representing this sphere of influence was in fact a Prussian officer who had entered French service, Baron de Perche. Perche believed that the importance of battlefield success lay in the selecting of what he came to call points of view. These were landmarks, therefore villages, woods, rivers, etc., to be used by a general to identify the positions on which his troops were to align themselves. In his own words, points of view are exterior and distinctive objects, chosen and determined by the General-in-Chief to furnish the direction for the various movements that he wishes to have his army execute, and to ensure the accuracy, the facility, and the precision of them. This definition makes known the importance of the practice of points of view, since it is on them that are founded the accuracy, the facility, and the manoeuvres of an army. In fact, it is by them alone that a general can give to his army the exact position which he wished it to take. Although he did acknowledge that maintaining perfect alignment for the entire army was impossible, he still highlighted the importance of it as much as possible. In order to achieve this, his tactics stressed the precision of movements, and although he never attempted to enter the debate involving formations, he tended to suggest linear as a preference. It seemed that the uniqueness of this idea of points of view held, in the French military minds at least, the secret to Prussian success, and they quickly adopted Perche's ideas into their instructions of infantry, starting in 1774. Opinion was nearly unanimous in support of Perche's principles, and it was felt that he had propounded the solution to a problem which had been long and unsuccessfully studied. His principles were felt to have made possible the speed and perfection in deployment and marching in line which the Prussians possessed. These ideas were further cemented in the instructions of 1775 and finally the Ordinance of 1776, which was to become the last of the ancien regime, also combining in an improved drill of arms clearly influenced again by the Prussians. However, the ordinance was not without critics, and several officers began to complain about the complexity of manoeuvres, which stressed precision and alignment as paramount. The Ordinance of 1776 was open to two general criticisms. First was the excessive formalism resulting from the strict adherence to Persia's principles and leading to overcomplicated manoeuvres. The second was the excessive reliance upon the ordre mince. Persia's triumph meant the triumph of the partisans of that order and exacerbated the dispute between the advocates of the two orders. All in all, it must be said that the adoption of Persia's tactics represented a deflection from the general line of French tactical development. A further issue was that, although Persia favoured linear formation and firepower, his tactics did not specifically specify for them, and therefore left the door open to the debate between ordre mince, or line, and ordre profond, or column once again. Returning to the debate was Mesnil-Durand. Not deterred by Prussian firepower and perfection of linear warfare, he still believed that his columns were the answer to French problems. However, he had softened somewhat on the effect of firepower, and conceded that some form of it would be needed before closing on the enemy. His solution was to reintroduce skirmishers, who would fire but not charge. Although less numerous than a full battalion's fire, he felt that this would not be a problem, and would be adequate to meet the needs of firepower. The fire of these skirmishers, while much less in volume, would be more accurate, and they offer a difficult target. Under cover of the screen which they provided, the battalions would arrive on an enemy shaken by fire. Although Mesnil-Durand did accept Persia's notion of landmarks, he debased the entire debate of line versus column into a nationalistic one, declaring the ordre mince to be Prussian and the ordre profond to favour the élan of the French. Mesnil-Durand had several supporters in the higher ranks of the army, including its head, Marshal Broglie, and it was therefore decided to hold a military camp at Vaissieux in order to carry out a series of tests to figure out the benefits of each system. Unfortunately for Mesnil-Durand, but thankfully for the French, this camp only highlighted the weaknesses in his system, as well as that of Perche's. The camp of Vaissieux was of capital importance in the development of French tactics. It crystallized the opinion of the great majority of French officers for a middle ground between the extreme positions of Perche and Mesnil-Durand. Mesnil-Durand contributed nothing of value to French tactics which was his own, save by keeping alive the fire of a controversy which caused the French army to test thoroughly the extreme forms of the ordre profond and reject them. This was valuable in itself, but it probably delayed the final consolation of French tactical progress by many years. Fortunately, the next major war was delayed long enough for this to be accomplished. Incidentally, there had been another voice all along, a balance between the two systems, whose ideas were to finally propel the French infantry into those we recognise as a key part of La Grande Armée. The most important and influential of all the military writers of 18th century France was the Comte de Guibert. With the possible exception of Saxe, he was also the most interesting. His importance lay in the fact that he devised the system of tactics which, after a period of vigorous controversy followed by eclipse, became the basis of the Ordnance of 1791. This, in turn, was the basis of French tactics for over 40 years. Although only 29 when he wrote his famous Essai général de tactique in 1772, Guibert's military education had begun at a very early age thanks to his father, a distinguished soldier who served as chief of staff to Marshal Broglie during the 7 Years' War. He gave his son talks on military matters and tactics, using maps and wooden blocks to represent the troops and armies. Following these basic lessons, the two would go out on reconnaissances where the young Guibert developed his judgment and recognition of the military features of topography. Then they took up their war game, the two forming armies and manoeuvring against each other on the pasteboard plans. The son was encouraged to make objections and use his imagination. Then the two would discuss the reasons for what they had done, with the father encouraging questions and even disagreement. Guibert remarked that his father made the study so interesting that they frequently spent the whole night at it. It was clearly time well spent, and the military world, in particular a young Corsican, would reap the benefits of these discussions. Although his essay put forth tactics for all three arms, as well as those of a more grand nature, I will, for now, touch only on his discourse on infantry, and leave the other areas for subsequent videos. Guibert felt that previous tactics regarding the infantry had become bogged down into a malaise of complex drill and a search for perfect alignment, both of which, under battlefield conditions, were practically impossible. Instead, he felt that infantry, now armed for both shock and fire action, should be trained for both, and in effect become universal. Guibert condemned the time wasted in useless maneuvers and the perfection of ridiculous details. He would reduce the manual arms to 4 maneuvers. Instead of drill, he would spend the time in fire training and in fencing with the bayonet, a practice unknown in that day. Thus, in this basic and elementary matter, Guibert insisted on simplicity and essentials. The soldier was to be taught only what was useful to him in his profession, and there were to be no useless complexities attached to any of these matters. Guibert tried to eliminate useless evolutions and to establish a multi-purpose infantry with the ability to act in line or column according to circumstances. As noted here by Ross, Guibert wanted his infantry trained in both fire and shock action, therefore opting for the middle ground approach. But this was not simply out of diplomacy, as he fervently disagreed with Saxe, Follord, and Mesnil-Durand, the main partisans of the ordre profond. Firstly, that fire action was ineffective and unnecessary, and secondly, that columns were the optimal formation for delivering shock action. Guibert condemned as completely false Follord's idea that force of shock was increased by the depth of the order. The law of physics did not apply, he said, because the formation was not a continuous mass, but rather was full of intervals. The shock was furnished only by the first rank. All that the rest could do was to crowd up and add to the confusion. Instead, Guibert opted for both fire and shock because he understood a key component to warfare, psychology. Before one could come in contact with the enemy, one must reach him without being destroyed or disordered by his fire, Guibert declared. To do this, one must gain fire superiority over him. The fire order, which means the thin order, is therefore the primary one. Guibert also felt that, because in his mind the depth of the column offered no psychological bonus, line was therefore an adequate formation for shock action. He did, however, accept that when storming a breach or attacking a post, then column probably was optimal, but in most other circumstances he believed that line was just as effective. Despite this, Guibert did not dismiss columns entirely, in fact quite the opposite, as he strongly advocated their use for traversing the often irregular terrain of the battlefield. He understood that columns offered faster and easier to control movements of troops, hence his famous yet often misunderstood phrase, columns for manoeuvre, lines for action. For battlefield manoeuvring and assaults, Guibert believed that a column with a 2-company front, the column by division, was the most efficient. He advocated using several columns covered by light infantry for attacks on fortifications, trenches, or salients. The double-company column could manoeuvre, deploy, or attack according to specific tactical conditions, and its use gave commanders increased mobility and flexibility. There are 2 key points here. The first is the difference between Guibert's columns compared to those of Follord or Mesnil-Durand. Guibert's were much more manoeuvrable, enabling much greater flexibility for a commander to operate with. Mesnil-Durand and Follord's columns in comparison were criticized by Guibert in his 1779 essay Défense du système de guerre moderne as being unwieldy and unable to take sufficient advantage of the terrain. The second and most important point has already been suggested several times in this section, flexibility. That was to become the key component for the French, and with Guibert's philosophy advocating for it, we can now look into what his methods consisted of. In terms of firing, this was an area in which Guibert was very critical, condemning the Prussian methods as favouring speed over accuracy, and agreeing with Saxe in that it was therefore a waste of ammunition. He said that this inaccuracy was because of a lack of effective firearms target training, something he desired to implement. He also felt that the feu de charge of the Prussians, where they would continuously stop to fire during an advance, was foolish and less effective than the defenders' fire. One could either advance on the enemy in battle, or one could not. In the latter case, one was reduced to a stationary fire action, but in the former case it was necessary to advance upon the enemy without stopping and without firing. This après method of advancing without firing is obviously similar to what Mesnil-Durand and the advocates of the ordre profond suggested. However, as mentioned earlier, Guibert was not foolish enough to believe that a bayonet charge alone would have any impact upon unwavering infantry. Either fire action or support from other arms was required first, but once the charge had begun, Guibert was opposed to stopping to fire once again. Guibert's biggest area of impact, however, was in regards to the movement and manoeuvres of the infantry. Known as evolutions, Guibert believed that only 4 were necessary: doubling ranks, wheeling, forming column, and deploying into line. He understood that performing any manoeuvre on a battlefield was difficult, especially if under fire, and he therefore advocated for the abolition of any other useless evolutions. The first of Guibert's evolutions, the doubling of ranks, was seen as a solution for infantry traversing open terrain without support and threatened by cavalry. The idea was for either the right or left half companies to march 3 double paces forward and then the remaining half companies to fall in behind them. The battalion would then close the intervals and present a narrow front, offering enemy cavalry little potential purchase, whilst the depth ensured a minimum threat to their flanks. The second evolution was discussed in no great depth by Guibert, but his proposed method of wheeling a battalion he credited to a Sardinian officer and had in fact been used by French light troops since 1769. The standard method was called a fixed pivot and involved much congestion as the subsequent ranks had to wait while the first rank cleared the point of turning. Guibert's method, known as a floating pivot, allowed for the company to split up into smaller segments, each of which could then march more directly to its destination without faltering at the pivot. The real innovation of Guibert, however, lay in his formation of columns by ployment, the third of his evolutions, and the complementary formation of lines by deployment, which was the fourth evolution. Under previous ideas and evolutions, forming column was complex and could only be done on the centre of the column, but Guibert's method allowed for the column to be formed on any company. He actually credited this method to Frederick the Great, though there is little evidence to show that they were used by the Prussians anywhere other than on the parade ground. As an example, when forming on the second company, at the command to march, the first company would move obliquely to the left, the second company would remain stationary, and the remaining companies would file obliquely to the right to each take their correct place in the column. In terms of deploying the column, the old methods of wheeling from column into line still in Guibert's mind held merit. However, he also noted their limitations, in that they were dependent upon the positioning of the column. He therefore advocated for a reverse of his ployment, which enabled the flexibility to align on any of the companies. For example, on the sixth company. Once again, the other companies simply file either left or right and take up their positions in the correct order. Guibert, however, went even further than this and promoted the idea of the divisional or two-company front column, which was to later be known as the attack column. Guibert felt that this size column was perfect for deploying into line, as the companies did not need to travel too far in order to reach their position. This is where things get a little weird, however, because he believed that this column could form on any of its divisions, but by doing so the correct order of the companies, 1 to 8 from right to left, would be lost. He did not see this as a problem, and was critical of the need to maintain alignment within the battalion, noting that it made no sense as all companies were equal anyway. He also felt that by losing this strict nature of internal alignment, it would also enable a commander to deploy the companies in any direction, thus concealing the true nature of his deployment until the last moment. Also, he claimed it madness when, if needing to ploy onto a road that was to the left, the need to first ploy into the correct order before marching back to the road, when one could simply just ploy onto the division already on the road. Guibert also believed that this method was so simple that it could, if desired, be conducted while advancing. The division on which the others were to align would maintain their regular pace, while the other companies all moved at double time. The radical nature aside, generally Guibert's ideas were sound. However, despite committing these ideas to paper in 1772, they were not immediately accepted, and the ideas of both Perche and Mesnil-Durand continued to dominate in the years leading towards the Revolution. It was to take until 1788 for Perche's ideas of alignment and points of view to be eradicated from French military doctrine, the change being inspired by von Saldern, a Prussian general whose work, Elements de la tactique de Infantry, appeared in French about 1783. According to this memoir, the essential thing in marching was not to maintain all the battalions on exactly the same level, but to maintain the intervals, so as to have room for the battalion guns, and to put all of one's men in action without ever having to break off files. The deletion of this obsession with perfect alignment was put into the provisional instructions of 1788, by which point many of the French officers were already in agreement with both Guibert and the Prussian general that alignment was only essential within a battalion itself. As for Mesnil-Durand's influence, as noted, the camper Vaissieux disproved and discredited his methods, leading most French military minds to settle upon the middle ground of Guibert and to look to his methods and writing for inspiration. The French officer corps had, as a result, divided itself into 3 camps, those who supported Guibert, those who supported Mesnil-Durand, and those who accepted parts of the arguments of both men. Indications are that the vast majority accepted the use of the line for musketry and the use of column for assaults on villages, posts, and entrenchments. The result of all these tendencies and memories was the determination to draw up a new ordinance to replace that which had been in force for the last 12 years. The Provisional Ordinance of 1788 was very different from those of 1774, 1775, and 1776, which had preceded it. It summed up all the progress which had been made since the 7 Years' War. Guibert was no more the editor of this ordinance than he was of the preceding ones. His influence was very strong, however, for it was his tactics which were adopted and became official. Although Guibert wasn't asked to write the ordinance, the impact of his thinking upon it was paramount. Much of the movements were simplified, wheelings were to be made by both fixed and moving pivots as might be required, and most importantly, some of Guibert's columns and their methods of ployment and deployment were used alongside traditional methods. Despite this apparent success, the level of detail that the 1788 ordinance went into did come under some criticism, but it was to be the events of the following year that would stop it being put into practice. When the French Revolution occurred in 1789, all thought of military matters were brushed to the side, and the 1788 ordinance was therefore neglected. However, with the threat of war and invasion returning 2 years later, military minds were once more put to work. The National Guard had been formed in 1789, but because of the neglect of the 1788 ordinance, they were instead drilled according to the official regulations of 1776, those written by Prussian. However, the previous criticisms and complications surrounding alignment quickly became apparent, and instead a committee was set up to put forth a new ordinance for their training. Although the editors of the new ordinance declared formally in favour of the attack in the Ordre Profond for the bayonet assault, they did not turn to the system of Mesnil-Durand for their model. They borrowed their methods of manoeuvre from Guibert instead. This set of instructions was published on the 1st of January 1791, but the work of the committee was not completed, as they were asked to put together new regulations for the regular infantry as well. This new ordinance was issued on the 1st of August 1791 and would be the basis for revolutionary and Napoleonic tactics, remaining in place for 40 years. It was the culmination of all the intellectual fermentation of the French army during the century, fixing tactics after the many variations of preceding regulations upon the intermediate ground represented by the tactics of Guibert. It contained the essentials of his system, columns for manoeuvre, line for combat, while retaining the evolutions of the line of earlier regulations, without insisting on the concern for alignment and regularity which had characterized these. So then, what exactly did these regulations entail? Firstly, the infantry were organised in the same way as first listed in the Ordinance of 1762, with 2 battalions per regiment, and each battalion consisting of 8 fusilier companies and 1 grenadier company. Often during war, the grenadier companies would attach to form grenadier battalions that were usually held in reserve. Within the battalion, each company was divided into 2 sections, and 2 companies together formed what was called a division. Confusing, I know, because several regiments are also called a division in a larger sense. The entire battalion could also be split into 2 wings, or demi-battalions. This was the basic setup of the French infantry until the 1808 changes made by Napoleon, which is something I plan to go into in a future video. In terms of firing, the regulations opted for 2 primary modes of firing, that by salvos and then fire at will. Salvo fire could be conducted in multiple ways. By peloton or company, by division, by demi-rang or half-rank, and then by rank, with the ranks firing always in the order of 3rd rank, 2nd rank, 1st rank. The first 3 methods were supposed to be conducted in fire by 2 ranks, with the 3rd rank holding its fire, but often this proved impossible as the men would want to fire even if it meant aiming too high in order to not hit their comrades in the front ranks. Likewise, the peloton fire could be conducted whilst advancing, with each peloton moving forwards before stopping to deliver fire. The front rank was supposed to kneel to enable all 3 ranks to fire in this, but it seemed to rarely occur. General Frederick declared that he never saw a French first rank kneel as laid down by the ordnance, and that it was impossible to keep a French 3rd rank impassive under fire. Fire at will was, confusingly, called by the French feu de deux rangs, or fire of two ranks, whereas in most armies it was simply referred to as fire by files. It would produce the rolling effect that is often described, though this would only last for the first discharge, as once each man had fired, he was to load and fire again as quickly as possible. Once again, this was supposed to be conducted in two ranks, with the third rank passing their musket forward for the use of the second rank whilst reloading their comrades, but it seemed that this rarely occurred. Captain Tansky, a veteran of the Grande Armée, declared that a soldier did not have enough confidence in another's fusel to rely upon it. He noted several times that soldiers only pretended to change fusils. The section regarding movement and manoeuvre is probably the most interesting, as in it was specified all the various methods of forming both line and column, as well as square. The French battalion column existed in three principal forms: colonne par division, which had a 2-company frontage, colonne par peloton, which had a company frontage, and colonne par section, which had a half-company frontage. Each of these columns could also vary depending on the distance or intervals between the elements of the column. This could be full interval, where the distance between the first and second elements was the full length of its front, half interval, where the distance was half that of the front, and closed, where the spacing was only 3 paces. As you can see, there are pros and cons to each, with open columns enabling more room for each element to manoeuvre, but it also leaves it vulnerable, particularly to cavalry. The columns could be named for both their front and the interval spacing, enabling a swift understanding of the required formation. For example, colonne par division à distance de peloton would be a column with a divisional frontage, so 2 companies wide, but at a peloton distance between the divisions, therefore half interval. There were 4 ways of deploying into line from an open column: left quarter wheel when approaching from the left, each section wheeling to the right once it passes the previous when arriving from the right. Both of these required column turns in order to ensure that the columns were parallel to the desired line position. However, if the column was perpendicular to the line, then it could also simply pivot the companies 45 degrees and march obliquely before pivoting back and forming the line. The 4th method was when the column arrived in front of the position it was required to form line at. In this case, the leading company would countermarch to the left of the line, whilst the other companies marched to the right and filed into line by their right flanks. These methods were the traditional ones, but if the column was closed, then Guibert's deployment was to be preferred. The regulations also included Guibert's divisional column, often referred to as the French attack column, though they refused to mix up the companies and thus didn't adopt Guibert's deployment methods entirely. Instead, the column was only ever to deploy on the centre companies, thus always maintaining the company order. In fairness, this was the quickest method anyway. Unlike Guibert, they also advocated for it to be conducted at the halt. In terms of evolutions of the line, pivoting was conducted using both fixed and floating pivots, depending upon the situation, and there was also a method prescribed for the passage of 2 lines through one another. The other important manoeuvre or formation that was described in the regulations was the practice of forming square in defence of cavalry. It was formed to be 3 men deep, by first forming a column of divisions at a peloton distance, and then the first division stopped while the middle division swung outwards and the rear division moved up to complete the square. It could also be formed by a column of pelotons, whereby the inner pelotons broke up into sections in order to fill the sides of the square, whilst the first and rear 2 pelotons simply closed up. As a side note here, I want to touch on the company order when in columns. In the above animations, I have assumed that the first company was always in the lead. However, I have also seen diagrams where the reverse is true. Quimby's book, for example, lists it in the way that I have shown, whereas the diagrams in Nafziger's show them in the reverse order. My own opinion is that I don't think there is a right or wrong answer. I imagine that on the battlefield both probably occurred with regularity, and, so long as the internal order was maintained, it would make little difference whether it was the 1st or the 8th company in the lead. The commanding officer would of course have to be aware of who was leading, and act accordingly in terms of his deployment. For example, if the 8th company was in the lead, then in the above animations, the deployments that I have shown would happen in the opposite way around. As can be seen, these regulations were not simply a carbon copy of Guibert's essay, but his influence is clearly strong, especially in the manoeuvres, as well as in finally ending the debate of line or column. They were instead an amalgamation of many years of military thinking and experience. Despite this, they were still subject to a certain degree of criticism, with some officers believing that several of the evolutions were unnecessarily complicated and not practical for combat. Marshal Ney, for example, felt that some of the evolutions and marching in line, whilst well thought out, were never actually practical during war, but as Quimby points out, it seems that at various points all of the different evolutions were in fact used. These evolutions, vehemently denounced by many as impractical for war, were all, nevertheless, actually employed with all their variations on the battlefields of the Great Wars between 1792 to 1815. However, there does seem to have been a general satisfaction with the regulations, and although field testing would provide the inevitable tweaks and improvements, they were a foundation for the infantry tactics which helped Napoleon and France see so much success over the coming decades. It is also not surprising as to why, because what they offered was flexibility. No longer were battalions bound as part of a whole army or entire line, where their movements were limited to that of the units next to them, but they were now free to move and act independently. Nor was any specific formation recommended or required, but instead the battalion commander was free to choose how to act to a given situation, and these regulations offered him the tools and options to do so. The local commanders seem to have tried to suit their tactics to their particular situation, and to have regarded the drill manual and the works of Guibert merely as a quarry from which they could draw whatever formations and movements they felt were appropriate at that time. The battalion commander then had numerous options available to him. Depending upon tactical circumstances, he could detach companies and send them forward as skirmishers. He could then reinforce his skirmish line using his entire battalion as light infantry if necessary. He could, alternatively, direct the companies remaining in column to deploy into line for fire action, or he could order the column to deliver a charge against an enemy line shaken by the skirmishers' fire. It is key to note as well that it was also the revolution and the notions that it represented that enabled the responsibility of the battalion's actions and formations to be put in the hands of such a subordinate commander. In the armies of the old regimes, the higher ranks usually consisted of the nobility, who would desire complete control over the battle, something which linear warfare allowed. Under such conditions, a battalion commander's task was therefore merely to keep his men in alignment and in the general's desired order of battle, but under this new French system he bore much more responsibility. Tactical flexibility and individual initiative became the hallmark of the Republic's armies. Let us then take a look at some examples of these different tactics and the flexibility in use. In May 1794, just 2 years into the war, we find the part of the Army du Nord conducting one of the more difficult manoeuvres listed in the regulations. Forced to retreat at Pont-Échine during the Battle of Tournai, General Etienne Jacques Macdonald's fine battalions seem to have executed a particularly complex manoeuvre called the Passage of Lines. At the Battle of Jemappes in 1792, we find French troops changing formation so as to meet the demands of the situation, and even completing their charge in line. Dumouriez ordered General Farrard to no longer amuse the enemy's cannons with a preparatory cannonade, but to advance boldly with bayonets. He recommended he make this attack in columns by battalions, to retain this formation in the village of Quarignon, and not deploy until his right joined the left of the centre division. This deployment was executed. Ferrand had his troops fire by files 3 times. On the right, Dampierre had formed his troops in attack columns, not masses. The Austrian artillery fired on these troops in an effort to delay or break up their formation. General Dumouriez ordered him to deploy his columns, even though Farrard judged that the fire of 40 guns was too heavy to allow him to make that manoeuvre. Despite that, the manoeuvre was performed without flaws. Once the 8 battalions had deployed, they marched forward at the charge. This force consisted of 2 Léger battalions, 4 line battalions, and 4 battalions of Parisian volunteers. However, in the same battle, another part of General Dumouriez's attack failed to deploy, coming under heavy fire as they did so, and were forced to retreat, thus showing the reality of the battlefield and the dangers of trying to deploy too close to the enemy. In another battle featuring the Army du Nord, they even had discipline and training enough to conduct an entire attack in line. On the 26th of April, 1794, General Cacoul used a line attack to throw back his opponents at Bossu. Our infantry advanced in line. We marched in this order with our weapons on our shoulders, braving the grape shot that their heavy artillery pieces were already vomiting. This audacity on the part of the French battalions caused their left to dissolve. Squares were also a formation that revolutionary troops were able to successfully employ, and not only that, but it was not the slow static formation that it is often perceived to be. It is well known that the Guard at Waterloo advanced in squares for their final assault, traversing the terrain without difficulty or disorder, but even the supposed lowly revolutionary troops were capable of similar feats. In his description of an attack at Guibert, Girardon states that the Chaumont battalion moved onto the open plain in column by peloton until it was just below Guibert. At that time it formed itself into square because the terrain was open and the threat of cavalry significant. It was joined by the 2nd Battalion of the 33rd Regiment, which also formed square on the left of the Chaumont battalion. Together, the two battalions charged the enemy with bayonets, deployed the battalions, and moved across the plateau at the pas de charge, striking two Austrian battalions. The French continued the pursuit, probably in line, as no reference was made to any formation change until they arrived before the Guibert chateau, where they reformed their line. This means that the charge was probably made in square, not column or line. When Napoleon is placed in charge of the Army of Italy in 1796, we begin to see the full potential of Republican armies led by a capable commander at a grand tactical level, but it was with a flexibility that begun at the battalion level by local commanders. Although not his original idea, Napoleon is often credited as ordering the first combat usage of order mixed, where a 3-battalion regiment would have the 2nd Battalion in line, with the 1st and 3rd Battalions either side and slightly behind of it in close columns. This was seen at the passages of Tagliamento and Isonzo in March 1797. In his report of Tagliamento, Napoleon highlights the use of multiple formations, as well as order mixed. The light infantry was deployed in skirmish formation. I ordered each demi-brigade to form their 1st and 3rd battalions in close column on the wings of their 2nd battalion. At the Battle of Marengo, and after his timely arrival, Desailly launches Boudet's division forward, once again utilizing order mixed. The 1st Brigade formed on the left of the main road, with one part deployed and the other in close column. The 2nd Brigade assumed the same disposition on the right of the road. Once Napoleon became first consul and began to assemble what would become La Grande Armée in and around the camps at Boulogne, the tactical proficiency of the infantry reaches its pinnacle. In the battles of the Empire, the most varied tactics were used. At Austerlitz, Napoleon prescribed the Ordre mixte for the decisive attack upon the heights of Pratzen, though it was not fully adhered to. At Jena, Marshal Lannes' corps manoeuvred both in line and column, although the line predominated, whilst Marshal Soult manoeuvred in column. Marshal Davout used very diverse formations at Auerstadt, though columns predominated. At the Battle of Austerlitz, arguably La Grande Armée's finest hour, we find Davout's 3rd Corps entering the battle straight from the march and immediately adopting different formations to suit the situations they faced. The 108th Line and part of the 15th arrived and seized the village of Solkonitz. Driven back, the French took up position to the left of the village, where they operated in open order and held back the Russians until reinforcements arrived. The 48th Line, advancing in battalion columns, retook part of Solkonitz and then engaged in house-to-house fighting with the remaining defenders. The 111th Line arrived next, and the entire regiment advanced as skirmishers. The 15th and 33rd followed, moving in linear order. Russian reinforcements counterattacked and forced the French to abandon the town. The 15th and 33rd then reformed into battalion columns covered by tirailleurs and retook the village and the surrounding heights. As can be seen in these examples, all varieties of the regulations were used, but that does not mean that they were adhered to rigidly, an example being the method of delivering fire when troops were in square. The règlement not only stipulated that infantry not only form the square when opposing cavalry, but it also prescribed the use of feu de Durand when battalions faced such an onslaught. Yet in battle reports, bayonets received mention time and again as being particularly effective, and volley fire, which was also overlooked in the manual, came into play. As the officers gained experience and even began to hold their own tactical discussions, this variation and deviation from the regulations only increased. Flexibility, a hallmark of Republican commanders, also characterized imperial officers. Though thoroughly familiar with the 91 Reglement, Bonaparte's generals never bound themselves rigidly to every detail. They modified them to suit conditions and their own tactical preferences. Ney, for example, altered the 91 manual to conform to his own ideas. He emphasized the close column by division as the basis of all maneuvers, abolished kneeling fire, directed his men to learn to charge in line as well as in column, and in a charge in line ordered the 3rd rank to operate as skirmishers or to act as a local reserve. In fire action, Ney directed the third rank to act as a tactical reserve, rather than attempting to load the muskets for the first and second ranks. For general combat, he favoured the use of ordre mixte. However, despite these adaptations and variations, at the heart of it all was still the foundation laid out by the 1791 regulations. Alterations of the manual were, however, changes of detail. All of Napoleon's commanders adhered to the spirit, if not the absolute letter, of the 91 regulations. Having seen in some of the examples above the revolutionary soldiers conducting complex and competent manoeuvres often under fire, why are they still regarded as poor troops, only capable of attacking in mass columns or as skirmishers? The answer is that it is a myth that has unfortunately been pushed, particularly in the English-speaking world, regarding the nature of that warfare. This myth originates from the idea that, because the revolution authorised the levée en masse, these conscripts were untrained, unwilling, and unable to use any seemingly more complex tactics than a column. The Allied view of events also unfortunately plays into this myth, because the French tactical flexibility was so unlike the rigidity of linear warfare that, to the uninitiated, it appeared as random, uncoordinated, and ill-disciplined, which of course it wasn't. The combat division, used occasionally during the old regime, became a standard Republican formation. Since they did not have to fight as part of a single rigid battle line, brigadiers and battalion commanders received a greater degree of tactical freedom than was enjoyed by officers of similar rank in the coalition's armies. Thankfully, many historians, particularly in recent years, have been addressing these erroneous claims and have begun to set the record straight regarding the revolutionary soldiers, one such being John Lynn, who tackles the main myth. According to this argument, in lieu of ability, numbers alone saved the Republic from defeat. In contradiction to this stereotype, French tactics actually displayed reasonable order, flexibility, and efficiency. In his book, Bayonets of the Republic, Lynn shows how the raw recruits were not simply given a musket and sent out onto campaign, but were instead often trained in the manoeuvres of the ordnance beforehand at various camps that were set up. He quotes Marshal Rochambeau in describing the type of training that he expected. Commanders of infantry units will drill their troops, as much as the weather and the locality permits, in the different manoeuvres of the line, particularly in the marches of columns, flank marches, forming the line, and in different manners of diminishing the fronts of sections, in the marching columns as well as in the maintenance of proper distances. Of course, it was not all as simple as that, and the needs of war often necessitated the troops entering combat before being properly trained to the desired standard, but even still, the troops quickly adapted to conditions and began to showcase all the key principles of the regulations. Although the revolution and its mechanisms had robbed the army of many of its senior officers due to their noble status, the troops themselves, at least in the early years, still consisted of about 2/3 enlisted men of the old regime. These men had been drilled, and some would have even taken part in the manoeuvres at the various camps, and as Quimby alludes to, any new recruits would have been shown the ropes, as it were, by these veterans, in much the same way as in 1813 with the Marie Louises. The recruits had only to march ahead, stop, face to right and left with their comrades. Those of 1813 did it perfectly, and so did those of 1793 and 1794. Their deficiency was in solidity in combat, for the cadres did not have enough stability to maintain their recruits as did those of 1813, who were supported by a strong discipline and esprit de corps. Once the new system of promotion based on merit began to take effect, and the various officers started to gain experience and confidence in utilizing the various tactics now available, it was not to take very long for the Republican armies to become competent and effective fighting machines. A final point that I would like to raise is that of the French attack columns. Much is made of this divisional column, seemingly of Guibert's design, though I am sure that the other nations will have used something similar during various points. It is most often associated with the French, and unfortunately has added to the myth that they only ever attacked in this formation, but the truth is that, like all parts of the regulation and the different military writings of the time, it was simply one tool in a vast arsenal. Like most of these tools, it had advocates and detractors. General Chambray, for example, was generally against them. The attack column is not employed as often as one might believe, and here is the reason. The infantry, when it marches on roads and when it is some distance from the enemy, it marches by the flank. When it is time to approach the enemy, it is then time to form up. The infantry then leaves the roads and forms by pelotons. First the divisions form up and then close to an interval of a section. Finally they shoulder arms and march out at the pas accéléré if it is necessary. One sees that, in order to form an attack column, it was previously necessary to deploy into line. General Chambray is correct here. In order to maintain the proper alignment of the companies, one could not form an attack column from a standard peloton or marching column without much confusion. Instead, it was easier to form it from line, which is what its purpose was. Deploying and ploying between line and attack column was by far the quickest method. However, in this example, Chambray found it inconvenient to have to cycle from marching column to line to then form the attack column, when he could just move from marching column to peloton column instead. Other officers felt differently, however. General Morin, one of Davout's divisional generals, was in favour of the formation. Describing the attack column, he felt that it was the most convenient in various terrain and circumstances, and that it gave the facility to change to other formations in the least time and with the greatest possible order. A battalion in colonne par division at peloton interval seems to me the best in these conditions. In effect, it cannot be surprised on the rear or flanks by an infantry or cavalry shock. The battalion can deploy in a few seconds with order and without danger. A column can change its front without deforming by pivoting on itself. It is the sole formation to assume in a broken or hilly plain, and it is useful in all terrain. It seems to me that it is basic with regard to the basic and fundamental order of battle. Like all of these techniques and manoeuvres, there was no perfect answer. It was all situational, which was the entire purpose of the regulations and style of warfare the French were bringing. No longer was one method in use, but instead flexibility and adaptation to the different battlefield scenarios was paramount. By 1796, the French cadres had begun to master the art of war. One begins to see all units operating in both column and line. The line continued to be the preferred method of attack, but use of the attack column was now common. The attack column had evolved into a tool that had been recognized by all French generals and was being used with greater frequency, but it was not the thoughtless sledgehammer thrown against enemy lines to bludgeon them into submission. I had a few comments in a previous video where I suggested that the French hardly ever utilized columns as a means of smashing into the enemy, and perhaps it was a poor choice of words, because they of course did, but nowhere near to the extent or exclusiveness that is often believed. As the examples above show, the French were capable of adopting multiple formations, and often the columns would deploy and engage in a firefight, which is what the regulations intended for them to do. Mesnil-Durand's idea that troops could simply march through the fire of an unwavered opponent and break them with shock action alone had been proven false. As Guibert stated, "Before one could come into contact with the enemy, one must reach him without being destroyed or disordered by his fire. To do this, one must gain fire superiority over him." The French would have been very aware of this, and experience will have taught them very quickly if they weren't. That is not to say that they didn't throw columns against unwavered opponents, or misjudge the timing for deploying, but very often this was by mistake, or the preliminary bombardment had proven less effective than was thought. Most often the French would only throw the column towards a position or an enemy that was vulnerable, of shaken morale, and ready to break at the mere threat of the bayonet. The mixed order formation is supposed to be the epitome of this. In theory, the line would engage and gain fire superiority, then one or both of the columns would quickly advance and rout the now wavering enemy. But of course, theory and practice are not the same, and things never went entirely to plan on all occasions. By the beginning of the War of the Third Coalition, a French division was much more articulate than a similarly sized force in any of the armies it faced. Each of its units were able to carry out individual tasks so that the whole could perform complex series of operations. This factor more than any other allowed French mid-sized formations to fight more effectively than opponents still encumbered with the traditional linear methods, and accounts for much of the French success over their Austrian and Prussian foes. This is not to say that these units were acting on their own accord, most assuredly not. It is meant that the divisional or corps commanders, however, could assign a battalion, regiment or brigade a separate task, that is, to do something different from what its neighbour was doing. The French infantry tactics during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic period were far more nuanced than the usual line versus column idea that is fortunately beginning to lose credibility. Years of debates within French military circles had helped to forge a new system which promoted initiative and flexibility. It was both of these factors at a battalion level that enabled the French to outmaneuver their opponents, who remained tied to a rigid system stuck in the linear style of the previous century. Hopefully throughout this video I have shown that the Republican infantry were not simply untrained masses fighting either as skirmishers or only in columns, but instead that they were competent troops and very capable of conducting complex manoeuvres even under fire. Although they certainly lost their fair share of battles, especially in the early period, this was to be expected for troops who had neither seen combat nor spent enough time to build an esprit de corps. On many occasions, French units would see their new recruits bolt at the first volley. It is not military instruction or knowledge of the theory of manoeuvres, but the unit's cohesion or collective courage that permits a unit to face enemy fire. The year 1793 was a year of training for the new French armies, and by 1794 they were capable of engaging in sustained firefights. Although his study focuses primarily on the Armée du Nord, Lin is still able to conclude that all the major elements of the infantry tactics associated with Napoleon had emerged along the Belgian border by 1794. As for La Grande Armée, they were made up of these revolutionary veterans, and this experience, along with the 2 years spent in the training camps around Boulogne, had built up a formidable army with a strong esprit de corps. As shown in the examples above, the infantry was tactically flexible, and thanks to the revolution and over a decade of warfare, they possessed capable commanders at all levels. Armed with the 1791 regulations, and with Napoleon at their head, it was little surprise the success they achieved from Ulm to Friedland. Until next time, thanks for watching.